Welcome, dear listener, to Family Shadows, a place where stories of fathers, sacrifices, and lessons learned in the quiet corners of life come alive. If you've ever felt the weight of family, the sting of being overlooked, or the quiet dignity of holding on to your values, this is where you belong. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the stories that just might remind you of your own. Today's story is called "They Laughed at My Old Shoes, but I Showed Them the Value of Compound Interest." Harold Bennett was 66 years old, and if you looked at him from across the street, you might have thought him unremarkable. A thin man with silver hair that caught the sunlight just enough to shimmer, shoulders slightly hunched from years bent over workbenches, and eyes that always seemed to be gazing not at you but through you backwards into memory. What made him stand out, though, if you cared enough to notice, was on his feet. A pair of brown leather shoes cracked at the edges, the soles worn uneven from decades of walking. Those shoes had been with him through nearly everything. The funeral of his wife, the graduation of his children, countless nights where he trudged home from his second job, too tired to eat but not too tired to check the lock on his children's bedroom doors. His kids, Daniel and Melissa, had teased him about them since high school. "Dad, those things belong in a museum," Melissa had once said, half laughing, half disgusted. Daniel would roll his eyes and mutter, "Just buy new shoes, Dad, you look poor." But Harold never replaced them, not because he couldn't. He could afford new shoes even back then. He simply didn't see the point. Money, to him, was never about how it looked when it was spent. It was about what it quietly became when it was saved. In his small home in Ohio, Harold lived a life that many would have called frugal. The walls still bore wallpaper from the 1980, the same faded pattern of pale green ivy his late wife, Margaret, had chosen before she passed. The couch sagged in the middle, but Harold still sat in his usual spot each evening, right under the lamp Margaret used to read by. And every night when the world outside seemed too loud, too hurried, Harold would take out his little black ledger, a habit he had carried since he was in his 20s, and jot down the numbers, income, expenses, and the tiny line marked investments. It wasn't much, not in the beginning, $20 here, $50 there. He had opened a modest account decades ago, a simple index fund, nothing flashy. He had learned about compound interest from a fellow mechanic when he was young. The man had said, "Harold, let your money work while you sleep. It's the only worker who'll never quit." Harold smiled at that line, and he never forgot it. So while others bought new gadgets, upgraded their cars, or spent on designer clothes, Harold invested. Slowly, quietly, relentlessly. And those old shoes, those shoes that drew the laughter of his children, were proof of his discipline. Daniel, his eldest, had grown into a man of ambition. At 35, he worked in real estate, always chasing the next big deal, always dressed in sharp suits that looked like they cost more than Harold's entire wardrobe. He loved appearances, and he hated being embarrassed. Melissa, 3 years younger, lived in the world of social media glamour. To her, life was measured in likes and hearts, in how well her Instagram stories sparkled with brunches, handbags, and vacations. To both of them, Harold's shoes were not just shoes, they were symbols of his smallness, of his refusal to upgrade, of the very thing they had tried to run away from, the embarrassment of being ordinary. They loved their father in the way children love out of obligation. They would send him cards on Father's Day, sometimes call him on his birthday, but in the moments that truly mattered, when their friends were watching, they preferred Harold to be invisible. The story of Harold Bennett's shoes didn't begin in that restaurant where laughter would one day echo around him. It began years before, in the kitchen where he taught his children about leftovers, in the grocery aisles where he chose store-brand cereal, in the gas stations where he put in exactly $20 of fuel because that was what fit the budget for the week. Dad, Melissa would groan as a teenager. Why can't we just be normal? Everyone else's parents buy them new clothes for prom and you're over here talking about coupons. Harold would smile, a quiet smile that never rose to argument. Normal is expensive, he'd say, and expensive doesn't last. Daniel, slamming the car door one evening after Harold picked him up from football practice in the old sedan, had muttered under his breath, "You'll never get it, Dad. You live like it's the Stone Age." And maybe he was right. Maybe Harold never got the thrill of appearances, the thrill of showing the world a flash of something shiny. What he got instead was the comfort of knowing every dime he didn't spend was a dime growing somewhere else, slowly, invisibly. In the quiet hours after work, Harold often remembered the promise he made to Margaret when she was sick. She had looked at him, her face pale but her eyes sharp as glass, and whispered, "Take care of them, Harold. Even if they don't see it now, one day they'll know what you gave up." It was that promise that kept him in those shoes, that kept him eating simple meals, that kept him investing when no one else believed in the slow magic of compound interest. By the time Harold was 66, he had become almost invisible to his children's world. They visited on holidays, but they never stayed long. They noticed the shoes, though, always the shoes. "Dad, come on," Melissa sighed during one Thanksgiving. "Do you really have to wear those again? People are gonna think we don't take care of you." Harold looked down at them, the leather scuffed, the stitching coming loose in places. He gave a small shrug. "They still carry me where I need to go." Daniel, already scrolling through his phone, muttered, "Yeah, straight back to 1975. The invitation came one chilly afternoon in February. Melissa called, her voice bright but rehearsed. "Dad, we're having this dinner. You know, kind of a fancy thing. Some of Daniel's colleagues will be there and some of my friends too. You should come, it'll be nice." Harold hesitated. He wasn't one for restaurants with menus that didn't list prices, but something in her tone told him she wanted him there not for him but for appearances. He agreed anyway. "All right, honey, I'll be there." As he hung up the phone, Harold glanced at his shoes by the door. He knew they would draw attention. He knew. In their world they were laughable. But he also knew something his children did not. Those shoes had carried him long enough to see what small steps, repeated over decades, could build. They saw worn leather. He saw 30 years of compounding wealth. And so Harold polished them the best he could, slipped them on, and prepared to walk into a night that would test not just his patience, but the values he had carried all his life. The night before the dinner, Harold sat by the small round table in his kitchen, the same one where Margaret used to serve meatloaf on Sundays. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. It had ticked through his children's childhood, through their teenage rebellions, through the silence that followed Margaret's passing. Now it ticked on, steady and indifferent, while Harold traced a finger along the worn wood of the table and thought about the phone call he'd received. Melissa had been cheerful, her voice a little too bright. "Dad, it's just dinner," she had said. "Daniel's colleagues will be there and some of my friends. Everyone's going to be dressed up. It's at that new Italian place downtown. You'll like it." But Harold knew it wasn't just dinner. When children invite their father into their world as if it were a showcase, it means more. It meant he was stepping into a room where he was expected to look a certain way, to behave a certain way. And Harold, in his shoes and his quietness, had never been the kind of man to impress at first glance. He stared at his shoes by the door that evening. They had been polished, the scuffed leather rubbed with a cloth until they gave off a tired kind of shine. He thought about the men and women he would meet the next day, people who drove shiny cars, wore tailored suits, and spoke loudly about things that sounded important. Harold wondered if any of them had ever worked the kind of jobs he had: oil-stained hands from repairing machines, night shifts as a guard when his children were young, moments when he had to choose between paying a bill or buying himself a new coat. The following afternoon, Daniel called. His voice was clipped, businesslike. "Dad, about tonight. Just, dress decently, okay. Melissa said you're coming and I think it's good, but just make sure you don't show up in those shoes." Harold let the silence stretch. On the other end of the line, Daniel cleared his throat. "I mean, people notice those things. It's a nice place. I don't want anyone thinking." "Thinking what, son?" Harold finally asked, his tone calm without anger. Daniel didn't answer right away. "Just never mind, I'll see you there." The line clicked dead. Harold sat for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. He could feel the faint sting in his chest, but it wasn't new. He had grown used to the ways his children distanced themselves from his simplicity, from the old car, the worn house, the shoes. He supposed in their eyes he had lived too small a life. Still, when the evening came, he put on his best shirt, pressed the collar as neatly as he could, and slipped his feet into those shoes. They fit him like no other pair ever had. They carried his weight with a familiarity that no expensive leather could replace. He looked into the mirror by the door before leaving. The man looking back was older, yes, but there was still a steadiness in his gaze. Margaret would have told him he looked fine. That was enough. The restaurant stood in the center of downtown, glass walls lit up like a jewel in the night. Cars pulled up in front, sleek black sedans, shining SUVs, while valet attendants in red vests hurried to open doors. Harold drove his own old car, parked a block away, and walked the rest of the distance. Each step on the pavement felt heavier, not from exhaustion but from the awareness of what awaited him. Inside, the air smelled of garlic and wine. Crystal glasses clinked, and the hum of conversation filled the room. Candlelight flickered against polished wood tables. Harold paused near the entrance, scanning for familiar faces. He spotted Melissa first. She was laughing, her hair shining under the warm lights, a silk dress draped across her shoulders. Daniel was beside her in his usual crisp suit, gesturing confidently as he spoke to two men at the table. When Melissa noticed her father, her smile faltered just for a second before she waved him over. "Dad, you made it." Harold walked toward them, his shoes tapping softly against the floor. A few heads turned as he approached. He could feel their eyes drop to his feet, then lift back up with expressions that hovered between amusement and dismissal. He was used to it. Melissa leaned in and kissed his cheek quickly as though it were a formality. Daniel gave him a curt nod. "Glad you're here, Dad," he said, though his eyes were already sliding back to his colleagues. Harold took a seat at the edge of the table, quietly, the way he always did. He didn't mind being on the periphery. It gave him room to watch. And watching was something Harold had always done well. The dinner unfolded with chatter about real estate markets, the latest vacation spots in Europe, and the rise of some new tech stock everyone seemed excited about. The wine flowed freely, laughter rose and fell, and every so often Harold would catch someone glancing at him, at his shirt, his hands, his shoes. One of Daniel's colleagues, a young man with a slick haircut and a watch that gleamed under the candlelight, leaned over and said with a grin, "So, Mr. Bennett, Daniel tells me you're retired. Must be nice, huh? Just relaxing, not worrying about the markets or the grind anymore." Harold gave a small smile. "Retirement is what you make of it," he said simply. The man chuckled, turning back to his wine, clearly uninterested in any answer that wasn't a brag. Melissa tried to steer the conversation away, but another friend of hers, a woman with perfectly painted nails, glanced at Harold's feet and whispered something to the person next to her. Harold caught the movement of her lips, the slight lift of her eyebrows, and then came the stifled laugh. It traveled around the table like a ripple, subtle but sharp. Daniel shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. He avoided his father's eyes. Melissa picked up her glass and drank quickly, pretending not to hear. Harold, sitting there with the laughter brushing past him, did nothing. He didn't frown, didn't defend himself, didn't apologize for his shoes. He simply reached for the breadbasket, broke a piece in his hand, and ate in silence. His calmness, his refusal to rise to their mockery, unsettled them more than anger would have. The laughter faded, replaced by the clatter of forks against plates. Conversation resumed, louder than before, as if to cover the awkwardness that had hung in the air. But Harold knew the moment would linger in his children's minds long after the dinner ended. And so he sat, listening, waiting, carrying his quiet truth like a stone in his pocket. The waiter had just poured another round of wine when it happened. The moment Harold had known deep down was coming. It began with a whisper, a soft, careless remark, spoken by the young man with the expensive watch who had already decided Harold was too plain to matter. He leaned toward his companion, not knowing, or perhaps not caring, that Harold could hear him. "Would you look at those shoes?" The man murmured just loud enough. "My grandfather threw out a pair like that 20 years ago." The woman beside him laughed, covering her mouth with perfectly manicured fingers. Another leaned in, curious, and soon the ripple spread. A chuckle here, a smirk there. By the time it reached the far end of the table, it had swelled into open laughter. Melissa's cheeks flushed red. She glanced quickly at her father, then at her friends, torn between embarrassment and loyalty. In the end, she said nothing. She just lifted her glass again, hiding behind a sip of wine. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His hand twitched as if he wanted to say something, but then he stopped himself. He was a man who lived on appearances, and appearances were everything in that moment. He too remained silent. And so Harold sat there, the center of a private storm, with laughter bouncing around the table like cruel little echoes. He looked down at his shoes. The leather was cracked, yes. The stitching along the edge had begun to fray. They had been polished, but no polish could disguise the years they had endured. These shoes had walked him through decades of life, through the factory gates at dawn, through hospital corridors when Margaret was sick, through graduation halls where he clapped until his hands were raw as Daniel and Melissa received their diplomas. Each scuff was a story. Each crease was a memory. To him they were not shame but testament. But to these strangers and even to his children they were a joke. Harold raised his eyes slowly and let them wander across the faces at the table. Some avoided his gaze, others smirked without shame. He could feel Melissa's discomfort, Daniel's cold silence. For a brief moment, Harold felt the sting of loneliness. The kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being unseen in a room full of people who should have known him best. Still, he did not speak. He reached for his water glass, took a sip, and placed it back down with steady hands. The laughter faltered. A few of them shifted in their seats. There was something unsettling about a man who refused to defend himself, who carried the mockery with quiet dignity rather than outrage. Harold broke off another piece of bread, chewed slowly, and looked down at his plate. His silence was not weakness, it was patience. He knew what they did not. He had lived long enough, saved long enough, invested long enough to understand that the worth of a man is not measured in the shine of his shoes, but in the life those shoes have carried. The waiter came by, oblivious, asking if anyone wanted dessert. Conversations rushed back to life, forced, louder than before, as if to bury the awkwardness that had just occurred. Melissa laughed too loudly at a joke. Daniel leaned into business talk with his colleagues. The laughter over Harold's shoes became another forgotten ripple in the evening, dismissed by everyone except the man who wore them. For Harold, it lingered, not because it wounded his pride, but because it reminded him of how far his children had drifted into the world of appearances, how quickly they had joined in the silence of complicity. He thought of Margaret, of the promise he made to her bedside. "One day they'll see," she had whispered. Harold, sitting there in his old shoes, believed that day had not yet come, but it would. He would make sure of it, not with anger, not with revenge, but with the quiet revelation of what a lifetime of sacrifice, discipline, and patience had built. And so he sat, while the laughter faded into memory, holding the weight of his secret the way some men hold a weapon, waiting for the right time to draw it. The laughter had left its mark, though the sound itself was gone. What remained was the awkward shuffle of silverware against plates, the exaggerated bursts of conversation meant to fill the void. People leaned into their neighbors, spoke too quickly, too loudly, anything to gloss over the fact that moments earlier they had all joined in a small cruelty. Harold, however, felt none of the urgency to mask or distract. He sat as he always did, shoulders drawn but not slumped, hands resting lightly beside his plate, eyes lowered not in shame but in thought. His silence was its own kind of presence, quiet but undeniable, and in some ways more unsettling than if he had protested. Daniel busied himself with his colleagues, throwing around numbers and phrases like closing deals and projected margins. Melissa tilted her head back in laughter at a story her friend told, though the laughter seemed brittle, like glass ready to crack. Neither of them looked directly at their father. Harold let them be. He was not here to force them into his world, nor to plead for entry into theirs. He had long ago learned that silence was sometimes the only reply worth giving. His wife, Margaret, had taught him that. He remembered a night years ago, when Melissa had come home from a high school dance in tears. Her dress wasn't as fancy as the others, and someone had made a remark that cut her deeply. She'd stormed into her room, slammed the door, and wailed that she'd never forgive him for not buying her something new. Harold had sat outside her room that night, listening to her sobs fade into hiccups, wanting so badly to explain that he had put the money away in her college fund instead. But Margaret had placed a hand on his arm, whispering, "Don't defend yourself. Let time speak for you. One day she'll understand." Margaret had been right about many things. She believed in patience, in the quiet dignity of a man who didn't need to shout to prove his worth. And so at this dinner, Harold carried her wisdom with him. He ate slowly, breaking bread in his hands, taking careful sips of water. When a question came his way, he answered politely but briefly. He smiled when he needed to, nodded when it was required, and otherwise let the voices around him rise and fall without demanding a place among them. To anyone else he might have looked small, an old man fading into the background, but Harold knew better. He knew silence had a weight. It was heavier than words sometimes. It settled into the air, pressing gently but persistently against the conscience of those who tried to ignore it. And indeed, as the meal went on, that weight began to shift the mood at the table. The laughter grew thinner. The boasts lost some of their sparkle. Every so often, someone would glance Harold's way as if expecting him to speak, to defend, to fight back. He never did. Even Melissa, in her fragile laugh, felt it. She darted glances at him, biting her lip, perhaps remembering the countless quiet sacrifices he had made for her, rides to school in the battered car, long nights when he stayed up to sew a torn hem or fix a broken lamp, but she said nothing. Daniel, too, kept his eyes down whenever they brushed against Harold's. Harold's silence was not meant to punish them. He did not wield it as a weapon. He simply lived it, the way a tree stands in the middle of a storm, letting the wind blow but refusing to bow. In that silence, Harold found himself drifting back to Margaret once more. He could almost hear her voice across the years. "You don't need to win every argument, Harold. Just live in a way that time will prove you right." He smiled faintly at that thought. Around him, the clinking of glasses and chatter carried on, but inside, Harold felt steady. He knew the time was coming, not tonight perhaps, not even soon, but the day would arrive when Daniel and Melissa, and even these strangers at the table, would see that old shoes can walk farther than polished ones if the man wearing them has walked with purpose. And so he sat in silence, the soundless rhythm of patience beating within him, waiting for the world to catch up to what he had always known. As the dinner carried on without him, Harold's mind drifted, away from the chatter of expensive wines and vacation plans, back into the quieter corridors of memory. He had always lived there in the simple places, where the noise of the world softened into meaning. He remembered the first job he ever worked, long before Daniel and Melissa were born. He was 19, a boy still learning to be a man, standing in the shadow of machines that roared louder than his own heartbeat. The factory floor was hot, the hours long, the pay meager. Yet when the envelope came at the end of the week, Harold would take out a few dollars, fold them neatly, and set them aside. It wasn't much, maybe $20 at most, but Margaret, then just his sweetheart, would smile when he showed her. Saving already, she teased once, brushing soot off his cheek. One day, Harold told her, these small pieces will build something bigger. It became a ritual. Every payday, no matter how thin the envelope, Harold set aside a portion. He bought no shiny watches, no fancy dinners. His dates with Margaret were walks in the park, ice cream shared from one cone, movies watched from the cheapest seats in the theater. But in her eyes, he never felt small. She believed in the quiet man who thought of tomorrow when everyone else only chased today. When the children came, life grew harder. Bills stacked higher. The house payment, the doctor visits, the endless grocery trips that seemed to eat dollars whole. To keep afloat, Harold took a second job. By day he fixed engines at the auto shop. By night he guarded warehouses, walking aisles of silent crates under dim yellow lights. He would come home after midnight, Margaret half asleep on the couch, and she would whisper, "You should rest." But Harold always paused by the desk before bed. There he'd open his little black ledger and record the numbers. He never missed it. Income, expenses, and that small line marked investment. Some weeks it was only $10. Some weeks it was nothing at all, but he always found a way to put something aside when he could. He remembered the first time he heard the phrase compound interest. A fellow mechanic had shared it over lunch, leaning against the hood of a car. "It's magic," the man had said. "Your money makes its own money, and then that money makes more, like rolling a snowball down a hill. Keep rolling, and it grows while you're not even looking." That idea lodged itself deep in Harold's mind. A snowball rolling quietly, invisibly, while the world mocked your smallness. He liked that image. He opened an account, small at first, with a local bank. Later, as his understanding grew, he moved to an index fund. Nothing flashy, no risky ventures, just steady, patient growth. Every month, like clockwork, he fed it with whatever scraps he could. It wasn't easy. There were nights Daniel needed new cleats for football, and Harold wore the same jacket another winter to make it happen. There were afternoons Melissa wanted a dress for the prom, and Harold patched his shoes again instead of replacing them. The children never knew what he had given up. They only saw the jacket too thin for the cold, the shoes too worn for pride. But Harold saw something else. Each sacrifice was not loss, it was a transfer. From today's comfort into tomorrow's security. He saw the snowball rolling. He saw the future being built dollar by dollar, interest by interest. Margaret understood. On quiet nights, she would sit beside him, watching him write in the ledger. "You're building something they can't see yet," she would whisper. "One day they'll know." And Harold would nod, closing the book with a small smile. One day. The memories washed over him now as he sat in that polished restaurant surrounded by laughter and silk dresses. He thought of all those nights, the cold walks home, the long hours, the choices made in silence. He thought of the shoes on his feet, patched and polished, worn through years of walking to work instead of buying a new pair. Every scuff on them was a deposit. Every tear mended was another line in the ledger. They laughed at the shoes because they saw only what was missing. But Harold knew better. He knew those shoes had carried him through decades of invisible building, of sacrifices unseen, of a snowball rolling down a hill so slowly no one thought to notice, until the day it grew too large to ignore. At the table, the waiter set down another plate before him. Harold thanked him quietly, his voice steady. Around him, the chatter rose and fell again, filled with boasts of promotions and vacations. Harold let them speak. He had his memories and he had his patience, and soon he would have his moment. The dinner was nearing its peak. Plates clattered with half-finished entrees. The waiters weaved between tables carrying trays of tiramisu and creme brulee. Conversation swelled, bursting with the sort of confidence only wine and wealth seemed to give. Daniel's colleagues were swapping stories about property deals and six-figure commissions, laughing as though the world itself bent beneath their ambition. Melissa's friends leaned in close, comparing the labels of their designer handbags, one-upping each other with vacations they had booked for the summer. The glow of self-satisfaction hovered over the table like a candle flame. Through it all, Harold remained quiet. He listened, but he did not join. He sat with the same calm that had carried him through factories and night shifts, through bills and hospital visits. The shoes on his feet pressed against the floor, solid and steady, while the voices around him floated like smoke. At one point, Melissa leaned toward Daniel, her whisper carrying farther than she intended. "Why did we even bring him here?" Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He glanced at his father, then quickly away. Harold's hand moved slowly toward his jacket, draped neatly over the back of his chair. He reached into the inner pocket and drew out a small, worn leather book. Its corners were softened with age, its spine cracked from decades of opening and closing. It did not shine. It was not elegant, but it held more truth than all the polished boasts filling the room. He laid it gently on the table. At first, no one noticed. The chatter continued, glasses clinked, laughter spilled. But then the man with the expensive watch glanced down and frowned. "What's that?" he asked, a hint of mockery still in his tone. Harold met his eyes, steady and calm. "A record," he said simply. Melissa blinked, her brows knitting. "Dad, what are you doing?" Harold didn't answer. With deliberate care, he opened the book. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, dates and numbers stretching back decades. Rows upon rows of deposits, small amounts that looked almost laughable at first glance. $20, $00, $35, $00, $50, $00. Some months skipped, others repeated with consistency. But as the pages turned, the numbers grew. Each year brought new columns, new totals, the slow, steady climb of a mountain being built one stone at a time. He paused at the most recent entries. The ink was darker, fresher. The figures, once humble, had swelled into sums that made the earlier numbers look like children's scribbles. "Every dollar I didn't spend," Harold said softly, "I put here. Every time I chose not to buy a new coat or replace these shoes or trade my car, every sacrifice, it went into this." The table quieted. Even Melissa's friends, who had been mid-laughter, fell silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the restaurant around them. Harold turned the book toward them, letting the figures speak louder than his voice ever could. The total, listed at the bottom of the latest page, was staggering. It dwarfed the boasts of commissions, the sparkle of handbags, the tally of vacation costs. 30 years of compound interest had woven a quiet fortune hidden beneath the scuffed leather of his shoes. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes scanning the pages. For the first time all evening, his confident posture faltered. This can't be right." Harold nodded gently. "It is. Money grows, son, slowly, invisibly, while you sleep. But only if you let it, only if you're patient." Melissa's lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. She stared at the numbers, then at the shoes on her father's feet, and for a moment she seemed to see them differently. The man with the expensive watch gave a low whistle, unable to hide his surprise. "You mean you built all this from scraps, from saving a few dollars at a time?" Harold closed the book, resting his hand lightly on the cover. "From believing that tomorrow matters more than today's show." The silence that followed was unlike the awkward hush from earlier. This silence was heavy, reverent, filled with the weight of realization. Around the table no one laughed, no one whispered. They simply sat, confronted by the quiet revelation of a man they had dismissed too quickly. Harold leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, his voice steady. "You laughed at my shoes," he said, not unkindly. "But these shoes carried me while I built something none of you ever saw. You thought I was poor because I lived simply. But poor is not the man who wears old shoes. Poor is the man who has nothing left when the shine wears off." He let the words linger. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth, backed by 30 years of discipline, spoke louder than any boast in the room. The leather book lay on the table like a stone dropped into a still pond, its ripples spreading in silence across every face present. Forks were set down. Glasses remained untouched. The glow of pride that had filled the room only minutes earlier seemed suddenly dimmed. Harold rested his fingers lightly on the worn cover. He did not look triumphant nor smug. His eyes were calm, steady, as though he were not unveiling a fortune but telling a story he had carried in his chest for too long. "Compound interest," he said softly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "It doesn't look like much in the beginning, just a few dollars. just a handful of pennies that could have been spent on coffee or clothes. But if you wait, if you feed it regularly and let it grow, it becomes something far greater than what you ever imagined. He flipped open to a page near the middle of the book. Small deposits, $20, $30, $50. He pointed to them with a weathered finger. This was my life when you were children. While I fixed cars during the day and walked warehouses at night, this was what I set aside, not for me, for the future. His finger trailed down the page to the bottom line, where the totals had begun to swell. And this, he turned another page, is what time does to sacrifice. Every cent I didn't spend multiplied. Interest upon interest, like a snowball rolling down a hill. You don't notice it at first, but one day you look up and the snowball is bigger than the hill itself. Melissa's friend, the one with the polished nails who had laughed the loudest, leaned in unconsciously. Her eyes flicked between Harold and the book as though she were looking at something she had never truly believed in. Daniel spoke, his voice quieter than usual, almost hoarse. So, all those years he stopped, swallowed, tried again. You gave up things for us, shoes, clothes, dinners, and you turned it into this. Harold's gaze settled on his son. Not gave up, chose. I chose patience over pride. I chose growth over glitter. That's what compound interest is, Daniel. It's proof that small, consistent choices outweigh grand gestures. He closed the book gently, the sound of the pages pressing together louder than any voice at the table. Melissa shifted uncomfortably, her silk dress rustling. She finally whispered, I used to hate those shoes, Dad. I thought they made you look less. But now I see. Her words trailed off, her throat too tight to finish. Harold smiled faintly, a smile that was neither bitter nor forgiving, but simply true. Shoes wear out, cars rust, clothes fade, but knowledge, discipline, and patience, those outlast us all. He leaned back, his hands folded in his lap. It isn't about money, not really. It's about what you value. Do you chase applause today, or do you plant seeds for tomorrow? That's what compound interest taught me. That's what life taught me. The room was silent, save for the low murmur of waiters moving through distant tables. Even those who had mocked him earlier could not bring themselves to meet his gaze now. They stared at their plates, at their glasses, at anything but the old man with the worn shoes who had just dismantled their entire definition of wealth. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging. He looked as if the ground beneath him had shifted, as though he had been standing on an image of success that suddenly dissolved into smoke. Melissa dabbed at her eye with a napkin, careful not to smudge her makeup, though Harold noticed the trembling of her hand. Compound interest, Harold repeated softly, his voice carrying the weight of decades. The world doesn't laugh at it because the world never notices it, until it's too late to catch up. For a long time, no one spoke. The candles burned lower, the plates were cleared, but the lesson lingered in the air, heavy as truth itself. The candles had burned low by the time dessert plates were cleared away. What had begun as a lively dinner had slowed into something quieter, heavier, as though the entire room was carrying the weight of one man's simple truth. Harold sat back, his hands folded calmly, watching the faces around him. Daniel, once so full of bravado, now stared at the tablecloth as though searching for answers in its folds. Melissa's shoulders had softened, her laughter gone, her eyes shimmering with something she had not expected to feel that night. Shame, yes, but also awakening. The friends and colleagues who had mocked him earlier avoided his gaze. Their polished confidence cracked in the face of what he had revealed. Harold did not speak again. He didn't need to. The silence he carried with him was no longer the silence of dismissal, but of authority. He had shown them not with anger, not with arguments, but with patience and proof. Slowly, Harold pushed back his chair. The sound of the wooden legs scraping against the floor was louder than it should have been. Conversations at nearby tables hushed, eyes turned. He stood, smoothing his shirt, and looked once more at his children. "I'll leave you to enjoy your evening," he said softly. His voice was steady, almost tender. "Remember this, wealth isn't what you wear or drive or flaunt. It's what remains when all of that is gone. Take care of your tomorrow even when the world laughs at your today." No one dared to reply. Harold reached for his coat, slipping it over his shoulders with practiced ease. His shoes, the same worn, cracked shoes that had borne the laughter earlier, tapped against the floor as he walked. Each step seemed to echo longer than it should have, the sound of a man who needed no validation to affirm his worth. At the doorway, he paused for a moment, just long enough for Daniel and Melissa to look up and meet his eyes. He gave them a small nod, not of reproach but of hope. Then he stepped out into the night. The cool air greeted him, brisk against his skin. Harold drew a deep breath, tilting his face toward the darkened sky. The street was quiet, the city lights reflecting off the pavement. He walked back to his old car, his shoes carrying him steadily, the way they always had. Inside the restaurant, the table remained hushed. For Daniel and Melissa, the evening had shifted from a stage for appearances into a mirror reflecting what they had failed to see. The quiet power of a man who had built wealth not for glory, but for love, for tomorrow, for them. It was, without question, a lesson they would never forget. Thank you for listening to this story on Family Shadows. If it touched you, if it reminded you of someone in your own life, please consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss the stories yet to come. We wish you good health, peace of mind, and happiness in your families. Because at the end of the day, family is the truest wealth we'll ever have.